Before the countdown begins, imagine this: a mansion with more than 100 rooms, acres of private land, imported stone, grand staircases, formal gardens, ballrooms built for hundreds of guests, homes designed by some of the most celebrated architects in America and paid for by men whose fortunes seemed almost impossible to exhaust. These were not ordinary houses. They were statements of wealth, power, and permanence, built by families who believed their names, fortunes, and estates would endure for generations. But across New York, that confidence collapsed in spectacular ways. Some estates became too expensive to maintain. Others passed to heirs who simply didn't want them. One owner tried to give his estate to New York State and was refused. Another mansion was stripped apart after its owner's death. One was purchased by an exiled king who never moved in. And one of the largest private homes in America survived more than 100 attempts to burn it down. The strange part isn't that these mansions cost fortunes to build. It's what happened when the fortunes, families, and institutions that sustained them disappeared. Because eventually, even a castle can become a liability. These are 10 abandoned mega mansions in New York that cost fortunes, then were left behind. And we begin with a castle where the money disappeared before the dream was even finished. Number 10. Dick's Castle, Garrison. From a distance, Dick's Castle looked as though someone had lifted a European fortress from another continent and placed it on a hillside overlooking the Hudson. But for much of its existence, something was strangely missing: a roof. The story began with Evans R. Dick, a Wall Street financier whose ambitions extended far beyond building an ordinary country home. After traveling through Spain, Dick returned fascinated by the Alhambra. He wanted to recreate some of that grandeur in New York, not as a hotel, museum, or public building, but as his private residence. The plans were enormous: more than 40,000 square feet, around 52 rooms, dozens of fireplaces, a 100-foot aqueduct, a man-made pond. At opposite ends of the structure were vast spaces intended to become a ballroom and an enormous kitchen. There were even plans for swan boats that could carry visitors across the water toward the house. Dick wasn't simply building somewhere to live, he was creating an experience. And the projected cost reportedly approached $7 million. Construction consumed millions before the house was finished. Then the money stopped cooperating. Financial trouble caught up with Dick. Work slowed, and by around 1911, construction had effectively stopped. The enormous castle remained a shell. Rooms existed, but many were little more than unfinished spaces. Grand architectural features had been planned, but the life those features were meant to contain never arrived. That's what makes Dick's Castle so unusual. Most abandoned mansions have a golden age. Families move in, parties are held, guests arrive, decades pass, fortunes decline, and only then does the house begin to fall apart. Dick's Castle barely got that far. Its golden age existed mostly in plans. You can imagine guests crossing the artificial pond, entering beneath the towers and walking into rooms warmed by dozens of fireplaces. But much of that world never existed. For decades, the unfinished structure remained exposed to the Hudson Valley weather. And then the story became even stranger. The building's unfinished condition eventually became financially useful. Keeping it uninhabitable could reduce the burden associated with owning a completed residence. The dream had completely reversed itself. A roof had once been necessary to complete the castle. Now, not having one could make the property easier to carry. Eventually, the shell found another life and was converted into residences. But Dick's Castle remains an extraordinary example of what happens when ambition grows faster than the fortune supporting it. A man spent millions trying to create one of the grandest private homes on the Hudson, and the dream ran out before the building was finished. Only a short distance away, another millionaire would encounter the opposite problem. His estate was complete. He simply couldn't find anyone willing to take it. Number 9. Cornish Estate, Cold Spring. Imagine owning roughly 650 acres in the Hudson Highlands. A mansion, formal gardens, a swimming pool, a greenhouse, barns, a garage, a working dairy farm. Then imagine deciding that instead of selling it, you would give the entire property away. And being told no. Edward Joel Cornish was president of the National Lead Company. In 1917, he and his wife, Selina, acquired the sprawling estate near Cold Spring. Unlike Dick's unfinished castle, Cornish's estate became a genuine home. The gardens were maintained. The farm operated. Buildings across the property served different purposes, and the mansion sat at the center of a functioning, wealthy country estate. But Cornish became increasingly concerned about what would happen to the surrounding landscape. Industrial development was threatening parts of the Hudson Highlands, and as his health deteriorated, he began looking for a way to protect his land permanently. His solution was remarkable. He offered the property to New York State. The state declined. Officials determined that the estate was not sufficiently suitable for the park system. Think about that for a moment. Cornish had the land. He had the mansion. And he was apparently willing to surrender control of hundreds of acres simply to protect them. Still, nobody wanted the responsibility. Then, in May 1938, Edward Cornish died. His wife died only weeks later. The estate passed to a nephew, but without the Cornishes, the property began losing the system that had kept it alive. Gardens faded. Buildings deteriorated. Vegetation advanced. Nature slowly began reclaiming what money had spent decades controlling. Then, in 1958, fire devastated the mansion. What had once been a living estate became a stone shell among the trees. Another owner later acquired the property with plans connected to a power project near Breakneck Ridge, but those plans also failed. And then came the final irony. New York State eventually acquired the land. Today, the ruins of the Cornish estate sit inside Hudson Highlands State Park. Edward Cornish had tried to achieve essentially that outcome decades earlier, while the estate was still intact. New York eventually got the land he wanted protected. It just got there too late to save the mansion. Number 8. Darwin D. Martin House, Buffalo. Most abandoned mansions decline because the money disappears. The Darwin D. Martin House encountered a different problem. Someone stopped valuing the house enough to preserve it. Darwin D. Martin was an executive with Buffalo's Larkin Company when he commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to create something extraordinary. What emerged became one of Wright's most ambitious residential works. This wasn't simply one large house. The complex included multiple interconnected structures, a conservatory, a long pergola, extensive landscaping and interiors designed to function as parts of a single architectural vision. The original project cost roughly $300,000 in the early 20th century, an enormous sum for a private residence at the time. Martin hadn't simply purchased luxury, he had commissioned architecture. Then came 1929. The financial collapse devastated Martin's wealth. His circumstances continued deteriorating, and he died in 1935. That could have produced the familiar ending. The wealthy owner dies, the family struggles with the property, and the mansion gradually deteriorates. Instead, something more destructive happened. Useful pieces of the property began disappearing. Doors, wiring, moldings, heating equipment, plumbing, materials that could be used elsewhere were removed. Then the property was left vulnerable. Children entered, weather entered, neglect accumulated. Portions of the complex were eventually demolished. A building Wright had conceived as a unified work of architecture was being dismantled piece by piece. For years, the house existed in a strange state. Its architectural importance hadn't disappeared. Its practical value to the people responsible for it had. And then came one of the most astonishing financial reversals in this entire countdown. The property eventually changed hands for roughly $22,000. Decades later, restoring the Martin House complex would require tens of millions. The architecture hadn't suddenly become valuable again. It had always been valuable. What changed was whether anyone was willing to spend the money required to protect it. Sometimes a fortune disappears and takes a mansion with it. Sometimes money isn't the entire problem. Sometimes somebody simply decides the house isn't worth saving. And at number 7, people destroyed a mansion for almost the opposite reason. They became convinced something even more valuable was hidden inside it. Number 7. Nullwood, Muttontown. Today, a grand staircase rises through the woods at Muttontown Preserve, You can still climb it, but when you reach the top, there is no mansion waiting for you. Nullwood is gone. Once, it was one of Long Island's enormous Gold Coast estates, a granite mansion of roughly 60 rooms surrounded by hundreds of acres. It had the scale and isolation expected of a property built for people wealthy enough to separate themselves from ordinary life. Then, decades later, Nullwood acquired perhaps the most unusual owner on this list, King Zog I of Albania. Zog had once ruled Albania before invasion, and war forced him into exile. By the early 1950s, he was living far from the throne he had lost, and Nullwood presented an extraordinary possibility. A 60-room American mansion could become a kind of Albanian royal court in exile. Imagine what that might have looked like. A displaced European king rebuilding part of his royal household on Long Island. The estate was large enough, the mansion was grand enough, but it never happened. Zog never moved in, the house remained largely empty, and the absence of a king created space for a legend. Stories began spreading that Zog had hidden treasure somewhere inside Nullwood. Some said gold, others said jewels, others simply said money. The details changed, but the rumor became powerful enough to attract people searching for riches that may never have existed. Walls were damaged, sections of the mansion were torn apart. Treasure hunters and vandals began treating the house itself as though it were merely packaging around something more valuable. The irony was extraordinary. A huge mansion built from expensive materials and sitting on valuable land was being destroyed by people searching for wealth supposedly hidden inside its walls. Eventually, deterioration and damage became too severe. In 1959, Nullwood was demolished. King Zog never established his American court. The legendary treasure never became the important part of the story. What remains today are fragments, stone structures, gates, and that staircase rising through the trees toward empty air. Nullwood wasn't destroyed by the treasure of a king. It was destroyed partly by people's belief that the treasure must have been there. Number 6. Idle Hour, Oakdale. The next mansion isn't simply a story about the past. Its problems reached well into the modern era. Idle Hour began as part of a Vanderbilt world almost impossible to recreate today. William Kissam Vanderbilt's estate stretched across roughly 900 acres along the Connecticut River. The original mansion contained around 110 rooms and was built largely from wood. Then, in 1899, it burned. Vanderbilt rebuilt. This time, brick and stone replaced much of the vulnerability of the original structure. The rebuilt estate reportedly cost around $3 million and became another example of the extraordinary scale on which America's wealthiest families could live. But unlike many Gilded Age mansions, Idle Hour repeatedly found new reasons to exist after its original family moved on. Eventually, it became part of Dowling College. Students and staff occupied rooms created for one of America's richest families. For a while, adaptations saved the mansion. Then Dowling closed in 2016, and Idle Hour entered a very different kind of abandonment. The problem wasn't simply that the building had become empty. The problem was responsibility. Ownership became complicated. Redevelopment stalled. Tax obligations accumulated. Preservationists worried about the building's future, while public officials considered what could be done. The mansion remained standing, and that created a contradiction that applies to almost every property in this countdown. Everyone can agree that a historic mansion is valuable. That doesn't mean anyone wants to pay for it. The purchase price is only the beginning. A roof needs repair. Stone needs repointing. Windows fail. Water finds cracks. Grounds require maintenance. Taxes continue arriving whether anyone sleeps inside the bedrooms or not. A mansion can be worth millions and still become a financial burden. So here's a question. If someone gave you a mansion like Idle Hour tomorrow, but you discovered that maintaining it, repairing it, and paying its taxes could consume a fortune every year, would you save it, sell it, or walk away? Tell me in the comments. Because at number 5, one millionaire spent years creating his dream mansion. Then he finally moved in, and barely got to spend a night there. Number 5. Carlton Island Villa, Cape Vincent. Some abandoned mansions feel tragic because of the way they ended. Carlton Island Villa feels tragic because its story barely had the chance to begin. The mansion stands on Carlton Island in the St. Lawrence River. Its location alone made it extraordinary. Water surrounds the estate, while the massive house rises above the landscape with a stone tower and dozens of rooms, the remains of a private summer world created during America's Gilded Age. The man behind it was William Osman Wyckoff. Wyckoff made his fortune through the typewriter business, and by the 1890s he had enough money to create a summer residence on a scale ordinary families could barely imagine. The villa was planned with around 50 rooms. It was designed for entertaining, for summers on the river, for family gatherings, for the kind of life wealthy Americans created when they believed an estate could become part of a family's identity for generations. But before the dream was complete, Wyckoff's wife, Frances, died. Construction continued. Eventually, after years of planning and building, Wyckoff finally entered the mansion he had created. According to the historical accounts surrounding the property, he died of a heart attack on his first night there. One night. Years of planning, years of construction, a fortune spent, and one night. The property passed to his son, and the family continued using it for a period. But the long future Wyckoff had imagined for Carlton Island Villa never materialized. By the late 1920s, its life as a family residence was ending. Financial decline weakened the family's ability to maintain it. Later owners arrived with new ideas, but those plans failed too. Then the building began losing the very things that made it habitable. Doors disappeared. Windows disappeared. Interior materials were stripped. During the wartime years, portions of the property were salvaged. The tower eventually became dangerous enough that part of it had to be removed, and once a building this large loses its protective shell, deterioration accelerates. Rain enters, wood rots, winter freezes moisture inside cracks, masonry weakens, vegetation advances. The mansion stops merely being empty and starts becoming a ruin. Carlton Island Villa would remain vacant for an extraordinary length of time, approaching a century without the normal residential life it had been designed to contain. And perhaps that's why this mansion feels different. The tragedy isn't simply that somebody abandoned an expensive house. It's that the life the house was built to hold barely had time to begin. Number 4. Laurelton Hall, Laurel Hollow. Edward Cornish tried to protect his estate by giving it away. Louis Comfort Tiffany tried something more sophisticated. He created a system designed to keep his estate alive after he was gone. It still wasn't enough. Tiffany was already one of America's most celebrated designers when, beginning in 1902, he transformed hundreds of acres on Long Island into perhaps the most personal artistic project of his career. Laurelton Hall wasn't simply his home, it was his world. The estate covered roughly 580 acres. The mansion contained 84 rooms. There were conservatories, stables, and around 60 acres of carefully designed gardens. And inside the house, almost anything could become art. Windows, furniture, lighting, walls, color, objects. Rooms weren't merely decorated, they were composed. Laurelton Hall became a physical expression of Tiffany's ideas about beauty. And unlike many wealthy owners, Tiffany understood that the greatest threat to an enormous estate might arrive after its creator died. So he planned for that future. He established the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation and intended Laurelton Hall to become a place where young artists could live, study, and work. It seemed like the perfect solution. Don't leave the mansion entirely dependent on heirs who may not want it. Give it a purpose. Give it an institution. Give that institution money. Create something capable of continuing after the founder disappears. Then Tiffany died in 1933, and reality began dismantling the plan. Financial reversals weakened the foundation. By the mid-1940s, it could no longer sustain Tiffany's vision as intended. The foundation moved away. In 1946, much of the estate's contents were sold at auction. The property was subdivided. Objects and architectural pieces designed to exist together began moving in different directions, and Laurelton Hall became another enormous mansion without the financial ecosystem that had created it. The house stood abandoned. Then, in 1957, fire gutted the mansion. Much of Tiffany's private world disappeared. But not everything. Hugh and Jeanette McKean went to the ruins and began rescuing surviving pieces. Over the following decades, objects and architectural elements connected to Laurelton Hall were recovered and preserved. So Tiffany's plan failed in one sense. The mansion itself didn't survive. But fragments of the world he created did. Cornish tried to give his estate away. Tiffany tried to finance his estate's survival. Different strategies. Same impossible problem. Neither man could completely control what happened after he was gone. And now we've reached the final three. These houses take the scale of this countdown somewhere else entirely. At different points in their histories, each ranked among the largest private residences in America. Two would be deliberately destroyed. The third came terrifyingly close. Number 3. Harbor Hill, East Hills. Harbor Hill wasn't built to disappear quietly. It was built to be seen. The estate occupied hundreds of acres on one of the highest points in the area, overlooking Roslyn and Hempstead Harbor. Clarence Mackay and his wife Catherine received the estate around the beginning of the 20th century, and Stanford White of the celebrated architectural firm McKim, Mead & White designed the enormous Renaissance-style residence. The main house alone cost approximately $781,000 to construct, at a time when that represented an extraordinary private investment. But the house was only the beginning. The estate included formal gardens and terraces, a 70-acre farm, a fountain, an indoor swimming pool, tennis and squash courts, and a carriage house. This wasn't simply a wealthy man's residence. Harbor Hill was a stage, and Clarence Mackay knew how to use it. The Prince of Wales was entertained there. After Charles Lindbergh completed his historic transatlantic flight, Mackay hosted a banquet and dance for him on the night of Lindbergh's New York celebration. F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald attended a party at Harbor Hill. Some events included multiple orchestras and elaborate displays designed to make the estate itself part of the spectacle. At its peak, Harbor Hill represented exactly what houses like this were supposed to represent. Money had become architecture. Architecture had become status. And status looked permanent. But permanence requires someone to keep paying for it. Mackay died in 1938. The estate passed to his son. The world around Harbor Hill was changing, and maintaining a private palace on this scale no longer made the same sense it once had. During World War II, portions of the estate were used by the military. The house deteriorated, vandalism increased, and eventually the family made the decision that would end Harbor Hill completely. Before demolition, valuable materials were removed, architectural pieces were salvaged, even enormous quantities of cast iron were stripped from the property for sale. The features that had once made Harbor Hill more impressive were now worth more when separated from the mansion. Then, in 1947, the house was demolished. Dynamite accomplished in moments what years of neglect had been preparing. The property was later subdivided for residential development. Today, pieces of the old estate survive in unexpected places. Walls, gates, former estate buildings, monumental horse statues that once belonged to the landscape. But the mansion itself is gone. Harbor Hill represents one of the most brutal economic reversals on this list. At one moment, every expensive feature made the house more valuable. Later, those same features became easier to sell separately. Eventually, the palace became worth more in pieces than as a home. Number 2. Rockwood Hall, Mount Pleasant Harbor Hill, was enormous. Rockwood Hall was on another scale entirely. On a hill above the Hudson River, William Rockefeller, brother of John D. Rockefeller and one of the men behind Standard Oil, created an estate covering roughly 1,000 acres. At its center stood a mansion containing more than 200 rooms. Some historical records describe 202, others give 204. Either way, Rockwood Hall ranked among the largest private residences in the United States. Rockefeller acquired the property in the 1880s and transformed it on an extraordinary scale. Historical accounts estimate his total investment at around $3 million. The mansion stretched approximately 174 feet. Massive granite walls enclosed dozens of fireplaces, family bedrooms, guest suites, servant accommodations, and formal rooms finished with expensive materials. But Rockwood wasn't simply a giant house. The entire estate functioned as a self-contained world. There were livestock, ponds, agricultural buildings, landscaped grounds, workers, infrastructure, everything required to keep hundreds of rooms and roughly 1,000 acres operating as one private property. And for years, it worked. Family lived there, guests arrived, the grounds were maintained. The enormous machine behind Rockwood Hall continued functioning because an enormous fortune stood behind it. Then William Rockefeller died in 1922, and the estate encountered the question that eventually reaches almost every dynasty. What happens when the person who wanted the mansion is no longer there? The property moved through the family and became entangled in financial and legal complications. By the late 1930s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had gained control. For a period, the mansion was leased as a country club. Other sections of the property found temporary uses, but none of those uses solved the central problem. John D. Rockefeller Jr. simply had no real need for Rockwood Hall. Think about what that means. One of America's wealthiest families controlled one of America's largest private houses. The problem wasn't that they couldn't understand its grandeur. The problem was that grandeur itself wasn't a purpose. A 200-room mansion cannot justify its existence simply by being impressive. Every empty room still sits beneath a roof. Every roof eventually needs repair. Every acre needs maintenance. Every building needs money. And when nobody has a reason to keep paying, even Rockefeller wealth cannot give an empty mansion a purpose. So in late 1941 and early 1942, the buildings were razed. The enormous mansion disappeared. What remains today is almost haunting, because so little architecture is needed to show how much once existed. Massive stone walls outline the former house site. Old trees remain. The landscape still falls toward the Hudson, but the 200-room mansion is gone. Rockwood Hall wasn't destroyed by treasure hunters. It wasn't offered to the state and refused. It wasn't suddenly consumed by fire. The people controlling it simply concluded that they had no reason to keep it. And if a mansion with more than 200 rooms could disappear, because even the Rockefeller family couldn't find a convincing use for it, then the mansion at number 1 should have had almost no chance. Because people didn't merely abandon this next house, they tried to burn it down. Again, and again, and again. Number 1. Oheka Castle, Huntington. Today, Oheka Castle looks almost impossible to reconcile with photographs from its abandoned years. The gardens are manicured. The rooms are furnished. Weddings take place there. Guests arrive. Film crews use the estate as a backdrop. It looks like a mansion whose survival was never seriously in doubt. But that's not what happened. Oheka survived by the narrowest of margins. Otto Hermann Kahn was one of the most prominent financiers of his era. In the years surrounding the First World War, he began creating an enormous estate on Long Island. The property originally encompassed roughly 443 acres. The house contained approximately 127 rooms. There were formal gardens, greenhouses, an 18-hole golf course, tennis facilities, stables, orchards, and enough infrastructure to make the estate function almost like a private institution. But Kahn had learned something from an earlier disaster. Fire could destroy wealth astonishingly quickly. So when Oheka was built, fire resistance became a major concern. The mansion incorporated extensive fireproof construction. At the time, that was simply a wealthy man's attempt to protect an enormous investment. Decades later, it would become one of the reasons the building survived people actively trying to destroy it. Kahn died in 1934. His family eventually sold the property. Like many giant estates, Oheka began cycling through uses its creator could never have imagined. At one point, it served as a retreat for New York City sanitation workers. Then, in 1948, Eastern Military Academy acquired the castle. The school transformed the building. Rooms were subdivided. Parts of the landscape changed. A mansion designed as one family's private world became institutional space. That new purpose kept the property alive for decades. Then the academy closed in 1979. Oheka was empty. What happened next should have killed it. Vandals entered, doors disappeared, windows were broken or removed. Plumbing and electrical systems were stripped. Garbage accumulated. The interiors deteriorated. And then the fires began. Not one. Not a handful. Historical accounts describe more than 100 arson attempts during only a few years of abandonment. More than 100 attempts to burn the mansion. Yet Oheka remained. The irony is extraordinary. A decision Otto Kahn had made decades earlier, when the idea of his private mansion someday sitting abandoned would have seemed almost absurd, was now helping protect the building from people deliberately trying to destroy it. Its fire-resistant construction worked. Not perfectly, the mansion suffered enormous damage. Water used to fight fires created additional destruction. Interiors deteriorated, but the main structure survived. Still, surviving the fires wasn't the same as having a future. Oheka needed something every abandoned mansion eventually needs: someone willing to take responsibility for it. In 1984, developer Gary Melius purchased the property. What followed became an enormous restoration project. Hundreds of windows and doors had to be recreated. The roof required years of work. Gardens were reconstructed using historic plans. Decades of damage had to be reversed piece by piece. And the restoration eventually consumed another fortune, roughly $40 million. Think about Oheka's full journey. A financier builds one of America's largest private residences. The mansion becomes a military school. The school closes. The castle sits empty. Vandals strip it. People repeatedly try to burn it. And then another owner spends tens of millions trying to reverse what abandonment had done. Today, Oheka survives as a functioning historic property, and that's what makes it the perfect mansion to end this countdown. Because we can see both versions. Look at photographs from its abandoned years, and Oheka appears finished. Look at it today, and the same mansion appears almost untouched by time. Same building, two completely different realities. And the difference between Oheka and so many of the mansions before it wasn't simply that its original owner had been richer. Harbor Hill had money. Rockwood Hall had Rockefeller money. Laurelton Hall had an institution designed to protect it. Edward Cornish was willing to give his estate away. None of those things guaranteed survival. Oheka survived because of a chain of circumstances, and because decades before the danger arrived, Otto Kahn had worried about fire. His fortune built the castle, but one decision buried inside that original construction helped keep it standing long enough for somebody else to save it. And that's the strange truth connecting every mansion on this list. These houses were built as arguments about permanence. Their owners transformed fortunes into granite walls, private lakes, towers, gardens, ballrooms, and hundreds of rooms, because estates like these were supposed to outlive the people who created them. But building an enormous mansion and keeping one alive are two completely different financial problems. Fortunes disappear, families change, taxes continue, roofs fail, institutions close, land becomes more valuable for something else, and eventually, a house that once demonstrated unimaginable wealth can become an expense nobody wants. Edward Cornish tried to give his estate away. Louis Comfort Tiffany created an institution to preserve his. The Rockefellers inherited a 200-room mansion and decided they had no use for it. Otto Kahn built his castle to resist fire. Only Oheka survived long enough for another fortune to rescue it. And maybe that's the strangest thing about all 10. Money can build something extraordinary. It cannot guarantee that anybody will still want it a century later. So of all 10 mansions, which one shocked you the most? And if you could save only one, which would you choose? And if there's another abandoned New York estate you think belongs on this list, put its name in the comments. It might become part of a future investigation. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten side of New York, subscribe. There are still plenty of stories hidden behind these old walls.